We are continuing our study now of Matthew, the 24th chapter. There are three different views concerning this chapter. Some people believe that all of the chapter applies to the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that would be the view of the premillennialist. And then there are others who believe that all of Matthew chapter 24 is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. And then there's the view, and this is what I believe, and that is that the first part of the chapter applies to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then in verse 36, there's a transition that Jesus makes to the second coming. Now, we are starting now with verse 23, so we're still looking at the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember how the chapter begins. In Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now later in verses 15 and 16, Jesus gives them the definite sign as to his coming in the destruction of Jerusalem. And they were to run. And it says in verses 15 and 16, Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now Luke's account makes it very clear that the abomination of desolation mentioned here, that is the Roman armies. When people would see the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, then they would know that they needed to flee to the mountains. It's clear that this was a localized event. Now, the second coming of Jesus is not going to be a local thing. It's going to be a worldwide thing. Everybody in the world will know when Jesus comes again. But in the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem, that would be a localized event, and the people who were in Judea, they were to flee to the mountains when Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. Now, as we look at verses 23 through 31 of Matthew 24, Jesus says no announcement of his coming and the destruction of Jerusalem would be necessary because it would be obvious to everybody. In verse 23 beginning, Then if anyone says to you, Look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Just as he predicted that there would be deceivers prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. He did that in verse 11. He shows now that will be the case. And then in verse 25, See, I have told you beforehand. We have a saying that to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And he said, I've told you beforehand of these things. Beginning in verse 26, Therefore, if they say to you, Look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or, Look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Folks, his coming would not be in secret. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus' coming and the destruction of Jerusalem would be as obvious as a bolt of lightning across the sky. And then he said this in verse 28, For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Now that was a figure used by Old Testament prophets to describe God's judgment on nations. You have it for an example in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 19, with reference to God's coming judgment on Judah and Jerusalem, as the Babylonians were their enemies at that time. He says in Jeremiah 19:7, And I will make void the counsel of Judah and Jerusalem in this place, and I will cause them to fall by the sword before their enemies, and by the hands of those who seek their lives. Their corpses I will give as meat for the birds of the heaven and for the beasts of the earth. You see there that when Jesus speaks of Judah and Jerusalem falling before their enemies, another world empire, well, then he says their corpses he would give as meat for the birds. And so here it is, this same figurative language used by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. Wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. God's judgment on the nation. Now, in verse 29 beginning, we have some prophetic language that would have been understood by that generation that Jesus was talking to about 2,000 years ago. He said in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Here he speaks of the tribulation. Well, he did that earlier, didn't he? We saw that in last week's lesson. In verse 21, he said, for then there will be great tribulation. When would there be great tribulation? He said then, at that time, then there will be great tribulation. That is, going back up to verse 15, when they saw the abomination of desolation, they saw Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman armies. And we said that they had besieged the city. They were there 3.5 years, and it would be a time of tribulation that the world had never seen before. And he said in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now that was language, figurative language that they had been accustomed to in the Old Testament. It was used for an example in the book of Isaiah, chapter 13. I'm turning over there now to the 13th chapter of the book of Isaiah. In verse 1, it says, the burden against Babylon. That's the way the chapter begins. I have a footnote in my Bible in the word burden. It says oracle or prophecy. So here was an oracle of God, a prophecy of God spoken against the Babylonians. And you drop down to verses 9 and 10. It says, behold, the day of the Lord comes. Now sometimes people get all excited and they see in the Bible, behold, the day of the Lord comes. And I think that just has to be the final day, the day of judgment when Jesus comes back. But that's just not so. He's speaking of the day of the Lord coming in judgment against the Babylonians. He says in verse 10, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Don't you see that's the same language that Jesus used in Matthew chapter 24? And the moon would be darkened, the stars would not give their light. It would be a darkened state that would come on the land, the Babylonian land, because this was a prophecy being spoken against them. Well, who would come against the Babylonians? Well, we know that the next world empire was the Medo-Persian Empire. So it says in verse 17, behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. So God would bring judgment. The day of the Lord would come. God would bring judgment on the Babylonians using the Medes as the tool in his hand for judgment. In verse 19, and Babylon, see, still talking about Babylon. In Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So in the midst of all of that, as he's talking about the destruction of the Babylonians, he says the moon's going to be darkened. And he uses the same language that he used in Matthew 24 in reference to the destruction of Jerusalem at the hand of the Romans. He says in the next verse, there, now I'm talking about Matthew 24 now, and in verse 30, He said, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven." In other words, this implies Christ's presence in the destruction of Jerusalem. It was not an accident that Jerusalem would be destroyed at that time in AD 70. Not an accident at all. But this was a work of God. And it implies the presence of Christ, his coming in the destruction of Jerusalem. And then all the tribes of the earth, it says in verse 30, will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. When somebody says, now surely that's talking about the final coming. You think, okay, here's the Son of Man, Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. But that's not talking about his final coming. It's obvious from the context, his coming, his presence in the destruction of Jerusalem. God's people were used to language like that in reference to God's judgment on nations. I want to go back now to the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 19, and in verse 1. It says, "The burden against Egypt." Now, here's the oracle or prophecy against the Egyptian nation. "The burden against Egypt, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud." So here's the Lord coming on a cloud, just indicating his presence, that God would be active in bringing this punishment, judgment on Egypt. Verse 4 of Isaiah 19 says, "And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts." So God was using another nation, as he did so many times, bringing another nation on the nation of Egypt, in this case, and God was at work. God was present, riding on a swift cloud, bringing judgment on the Egyptians. All right, now as we return to Matthew 24, and what's said in the next verse, verse 31, "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." From one end of the earth to the other. Here's the worldwide success of the gospel. And I think we can see that the fall of Judaism, that would contribute to the success of the gospel and the proclamation of it. And so this was a very significant event in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. The genealogical records of the Jews were destroyed, bringing an end to Judaism, and this would contribute to the success, worldwide success of the gospel. Now, in verses 32 and 33, he shows that the time of Jesus' coming and the destruction of Jerusalem, that it could be known, the time could be known, that there would be these signs pointing to it. So he says in verses 32 and 33, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors." It's near. It's at hand. Would Jesus be saying here, 2,000 years ago, in AD 33, that the end of the world was near? See, we're today living in the year 2021, and we're looking for Jesus' coming. And when he comes, and this earth was going to be burned up, it's all coming to an end. Is that what he's talking about? He would not have been saying, just prior to his death in AD 33, that the end of the world was near. He says in verse 33, "So you also," that is, the people he was talking to back in AD 33, that audience, he says, "You also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors." He said, the things that I've been talking to you about up to this time, all these signs, all these things that would happen, in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem and leading up to it. When you see these things, know that it is near. What's the most natural way then to interpret the next verse, verse 34? Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Well, he's not talking about our generation. He's talking about that generation, the ones that Jesus was talking to. He said, a lot of you people are still going to be alive when this happens, the destruction of Jerusalem. So then in verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And so that's the absolute certainty of all that Jesus said to them. His words will stand forever, and they would be fulfilled. And they were fulfilled. About 40 years from the time that Jesus spoke those things in the year AD 70. So in verse 36, we have that transition that I talked about earlier. And he says in verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So he had been talking about the Lord's coming in the destruction of Jerusalem, and he said, here are the signs. The signs point to it. But now, transitioning to the second coming of Jesus that we are looking for, he says, there will be no signs, no signs. No one knows, not even the angels of heaven, when that day and hour will be. Only the Father in heaven knows. In verses 37 through 39, Jesus' second coming is compared to the days of Noah and when God came in the flood. He said, but as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came, and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now the comparison in the time of Jesus' second coming and the time when Noah was on the earth, the comparison is not the wickedness of the world then and now, or when Jesus will come again. Not the wicked. It was wicked then in the days of Noah, and be wicked when Jesus comes again. That's not it. But the suddenness of his coming on an unexpected world. Well, in the days of Noah, he says the people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, going about the normal activities of life. And then the flood came on this unexpected world. And that's the way it will be when Jesus comes again. In verses 40 and 41, he says, one will be taken, the other left when Jesus comes again. What's that about? He says in verse 40, then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. You see, they're just going about the normal activities of life. 2 men out here working in the field. But then when Jesus comes, one will be taken, the other left. Verse 41, 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. I believe that a good commentary that we have on that are Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. And this is speaking of the second coming of Jesus. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. He said when Jesus comes again, then the dead in Christ will rise first and be caught up to meet the Lord. And then those who are alive, they may be out working in the field. But whatever it is they're doing, going, about normal activities of life, here Jesus comes. And those who are alive and are righteous, then they're going to be caught up with those who have preceded them in death and be with the Lord. And then that raises the question, though, what about those who are not righteous when Jesus comes? Well, they're not going to be taken. They're not going to be caught up to be with the righteous. They will be left. And I believe that's what he's talking about here in Matthew chapter 24. The righteous will be caught up, but what of the wicked who are alive at his coming? Well, there's just going to be this eternal separation from the righteous and the wicked. Now, this is not teaching what people commonly refer to as the rapture theory, that when Jesus comes again, that the righteous are going to be raptured up and be with the Lord for 7 years, to escape the 7 years of great tribulation on the earth. This doesn't say anything about 7 years. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, when it says the righteous will be caught up to meet the Lord and those who preceded them in death, it says, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Nothing about 7 years, but that's going to be our situation from now on, that we're always going to be with the Lord. And the rapture theory, as that is being taught today, it's just not in the Bible. Now, reading in Matthew 24, 42 through 44. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Let's just suppose that you could read somewhere in the Bible where Jesus said, I'm coming on December the 12th, the year 2050. So, about 30 years from now, we would know that Jesus is coming. He's coming about 30 years from now, in the year 2050. You think we would be watchful now? Would there be a need to be vigilant and alert for the coming of Jesus today, tomorrow, next week, next year, or even in the next decade? No, because here we would have a promise in the Bible as to the exact time that Jesus is coming. The uncertainty of the time of the coming of Jesus should prompt us to watch, to be vigilant and alert, because he could very well come today. Now here's how the chapter ends. Verses 45 through 51, you have the parable of the faithful servant and the evil servant. The faithful and wise servant will watch for his return. Verse 45, who then is faithful and wise, a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant, now that servant would be the one who's not faithful and wise. The master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now what he says there in that last verse that I've just read about the punishment coming upon that servant who's not faithful and wise and is not watching for the return of Jesus, in contrast is, verse 47. That faithful and wise servant, the one who'll get a reward, verse 47 says, surely I say to you that that master will make him ruler over all his goods. So the need to always be watchful and ready for the coming of Jesus. We just don't know when that day will be. Now, if the angels of heaven do not know the time of Jesus' coming, then why would we think that any man on earth would know? And how is it then that men on earth have tried to predict the time of the coming of Jesus? You know, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they've been known for making their bold predictions as to when the end of the world would happen, or when the end of the world as we know it today, when that would happen, when Jesus would come again. They predicted 1914, 1918, 1925, 1945, 1975. And then there are those who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. They have also predicted the time that Jesus would return. Jesus' point is that there will be no signs to indicate the time of his coming. And therefore, watch. Always be ready. I heard someone say one time, live every day like it was your last, because someday you will be right, and then you will be prepared. Someday will be your last day on this earth, either because Jesus has come or because it's the day of your death. But you need to live each day as though it was your last, because someday you will be right, and you want to be prepared for when that day comes. The need for watchfulness, the need to always be prepared for Jesus' second coming, is continued in Matthew chapter 25. And so be studying that. Look at the study questions that will help you in your study for your consideration of Matthew chapter 25. Thank you for your participation.